Welcome to the Money Rules Podcast, where we tackle your personal financial matters with leading financial advisors. Your host, Boitumelo Ntsoko.
Welcome to the Money Rules Podcast. I'm your host, Boitumelo Ntsoko. Today isn't just any episode, it's the 100th episode. That's 100 conversations and 100 opportunities to challenge how we think about money. And none of it would have been possible without you. I wanted to make this milestone episode a bit different and a little personal, so I reached out to 5 financial advisors and asked them a simple but powerful question. What's the biggest financial mistake you've ever made? Because, let's face it, we all make mistakes with money. Yes, even the people who help others avoid them for a living. The difference is they've learned how to recover, adapt, and grow from them. In this episode, you'll hear 5 short stories about what went wrong, how they overcame it, and the best financial advice they've ever received. Let's dive right in with our first guest, Elke Brink, a wealth advisor at PSG Wealth. Elke was actually my first ever guest on this podcast, so it's fitting to have her on the 100th episode. Thank you for joining us, Elke.
Thank you so much for having me. And how wonderful is it that we are 100 episodes in?
It's totally amazing. I can't believe that we've reached this milestone. Elke, I know this isn't always easy to share, but can you tell us about a financial decision you regret and how you turned it around? Then tell us about the best advice you've ever received about managing money.
Yes, of course. And I think it's actually so wonderful to think about this because I think coming from an advisory side, of course, we are also just human and we also make mistakes. And I think starting off as a younger working person, we all need to build our portfolios and start finding our feet in life. So no one has a perfect financial portfolio and planning from day one. I think looking back, especially when I started in the workforce and when you start planning your life, one thing I really did learn was, and I learned it the hard way, is to really start building up an emergency fund earlier on in life and always having one in place. I think life so quickly sometimes goes wrong on a monthly basis, for example, where a few different unforeseen expenses happen at once. So something breaking in your house and together with your wheels on your car having to be replaced and an emergency service here and an unforeseen medical expense there. And before you see it, in literally a month or 2, you can completely be overwhelmed with expenses that you didn't plan for. So it's not like it was a holiday or something nice you were planning for. And then you're in trouble if you don't really have an emergency fund. So then either you need to start dipping into savings. And if you're a younger person, you maybe don't have a lot of savings yet. So then it becomes a problem where you start accessing this. And I think this can very quickly start snowballing. I think once you go into almost a debt cycle and you have to start dipping into that, it's difficult to get out of it again. Yeah, that definitely happened to me, having some unforeseen expenses. That's something I definitely learned, making very sure on a monthly basis I put funds away for an emergency fund. And this can, of course, also be used for something fun, like a holiday or something else. But it's good to just have it there. And I think we all learned that lesson deeply in the pandemic, where sometimes things you think are in a safe place or your job is in a safe space and then you lose your job or something. So having also a bit of planning of having a few months emergency fund. I think the best advice I've received and something I feel very strongly as also as a female is building a situation where you are financially independent. I think it's important from an earlier age to really financially educate yourself just out of a protection mechanism. Even if you are in a perfect marriage or something, someone may fall ill or someone may pass away. I think it's important to understand your own financial life and to plan to be secure as an individual. And that's something I would always work hard on, to not be dependent on someone else should things go wrong.
I think that's actually such great advice because a lot of women find themselves in unfortunate situations that they can't leave because they don't have their own financial backing. So that's very important. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Elke.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Let's keep the momentum going with our next guest, Erin White, a certified financial planner at Crew Invest. Erin, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Could you take us back to one of your biggest money missteps and then tell us what's the best financial advice that stuck with you?
Sure. So it was I want to say a big one, but if you can believe it or not, I would say one of my biggest financial mistakes was not communicating with my ex-spouse about finances. And the result of that was we met when I was quite young, and I felt that I couldn't talk to him about it. You know, he earned more than me, and I was, I wouldn't say scared to broach the subject, but I felt I didn't have a voice in the relationship to broach the subject. And the result of that was that we didn't openly communicate about money. It was very awkward conversations to have. And at a point where it really became a problem, I didn't hold him accountable. So when I got to the realization that, you know, he didn't understand what credit was, and he was unable to manage debt responsibly or spending responsibly, it just resulted in a lot of issues between the two of us. So I would say that was certainly the biggest financial mistake I ever made. And the advice that I got at the time was that finance is not just the responsibility of the person who's potentially earning the money or more money in the relationship, or the person that's spending the money in the relationship, but is really the responsibility of both parties in terms of the finances and accountability of both parties. So moving forward, you know, the relationship that I got into after that, I made sure that we started speaking about finances a lot earlier on. And it's not to say that you've got to open up your budget on the first date, but just so that it's not awkward. You know, you don't want to wait until you're living together or married to start having these discussions.
I think that's such an important thing because communication is quite key in a relationship to keep it going, especially when it comes to finances. So thank you so much for sharing that valuable lesson with us.
It's a pleasure.
Now let's hear from Gareth Collier, a certified financial planner at Firecrest Group. Gareth, take us through a money move you made that you might handle differently today, and then close us off with the best financial advice that's shaped how you approach money today.
Yeah, to me, I think mine might be a little bit boring, but it's definitely a classic. I think sort of as a young 20-something-year-old boy who had been working for a little bit and built up a bit of savings, you know, now sort of quite fancied the idea of getting himself a nice car. You know, the little City Golf didn't feel quite good enough anymore. And I somehow managed to convince myself that an Audi A3 is definitely what I wanted. So, you know, I did a little bit of homework, landed up buying a second-hand one off Gumtree back in the day. But it was only when I went around to organize the insurance for the car that I actually learned that I'd actually overpaid for it by about 10,000 Rand. And that was really kind of picked up from what I paid for it versus what I could insure it for. And I think I kind of realized over the years, you know, I was so blinded by this need at the time to have a nice car that kind of those like rational decision-making points were pretty much, you know, they weren't even ignored. I think they just didn't even occur to me in the first place. You know, you're so convinced that you've got to do this thing, you know, whether it was for yourself or whether it's a bit of keeping up with the Joneses kind of thing. So, you know, unfortunately, I had to learn that lesson, and you know, I did have to take a bit of a knock on it. So I had to absorb that 10,000 Rand loss because I ended up selling it again about 6 months later to start a business. But I think really it kind of taught me that, you know, that specific point on that typical example was, you know, make sure you're checking those book values and things when you're making these decisions. And it's funny enough, a lesson obviously I've conversed with clients over the years now when they were looking at making similar choices to kind of learn from my mistake back in the day. Thankfully, you know, over time, it's relatively speaking not a huge financial loss, but it was certainly a lesson with a bit of a sting in the tail. I think on the other side, you know, the best lesson that's really stuck with me, funny enough, wasn't something I was sort of sat down and taken through or whatever. It was, you know, when I was younger and I was studying, I was working in another company, and part of that business is they did logistics. And they also used to sell products. And, you know, that company had a presence in sort of in Cape Town, Durban, and Joburg. And it was a lot of imported stuff. And during one of the presentations, sort of the Johannesburg manager sort of stood up and was presenting the figures and talking about the fact that, because these products were marketed by the same business across the country, that the selling price couldn't really be changed all that much. And he showed how, where they made their money was what they could save on the transport costs. I think he framed it that, the money we make is the money we don't spend. Now, I'm not saying, don't spend money, but it was something kind of, I realized in the moment, and I've kind of reflected on it over time, that during that presentation, for my line of thinking was far too linear. I was just kind of, in my mind, I was only looking forward and thinking about, how could they overcome sort of justifying a higher price to customers in Joburg because of these transport costs, rather than actually kind of looking at a problem from both directions, and seeing what you can do about it. And I think from a finance perspective, it's been a great reminder to me that, like, when you're making financial decisions, to really consider those opportunity costs, and that's really just to help you kind of either put your mind at rest about the decisions that you're wanting to make, or also, have you considered alternatives that might be better suited? So I think, it's such a lovely little touch point for myself personally, and it's a good shortcut, and a reminder that obviously, depending on the scale of the decision that you're making, you can either quickly or just thoroughly stress test that decision, just to make sure that I'm fully comfortable with that chosen path.
I think that's such a beautiful lesson. When people buy their dream car or they see their dream car, all rational goes out the window, and you also end up with people entering into balloon payments as well. So that's such a valuable lesson that you shared with us. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Thank you again.
Let's turn to Dawn Ridlett now, who is a certified financial planner at Rexilum Invest. Dawn, you've helped many people make smart money moves, but today we want to hear about a time things didn't go as planned for you. What went wrong? What did you learn from it? And what's the one financial principle or piece of advice that's guided you since?
I think the biggest mistake I made, and it was fairly early on, but, we're probably talking about 15 years ago, was not having a big enough emergency fund. Right? Cash flow is king. And I think over the pandemic, a lot of clients probably also learned that lesson the hard way, that you have to have a buffer of probably between 3 and 6 months of your expenses. I mean, that doesn't include sort of contributions to things like retirement annuities, but certainly to cover all expenses. Because, when the chips are down and something goes wrong, like it did during the pandemic, suddenly trying to find that cash flow is very difficult. And so obviously, I mean, the fix for that was fairly simple. I now have a nice, healthy emergency fund. Look, it's in a decent interest, but it is available to me at pretty short notice, at a sort of 24-hour short notice. And that has done a lot for my peace of mind, apart from anything else.
And the best piece of financial advice you've ever received?
I think the best piece of financial advice I've ever received was back when I was didn't have a financial advisor and I was not in the industry yet. And the advice I was given was when it came to managing debt, and obviously I was a lot younger and had mortgage and some credit card debt and that kind of thing, was to make a list of all the debt that you've got and, what your minimum repayments are, but more importantly, to put in there what the interest rates are. Right. And then to have a plan to pay off that debt, starting with the most expensive debt, the one with the highest interest first. And you can also sort of do the hand and foot, do that with picking the ones that are the smallest as well, and then picking them off one by one, starting with the most expensive and working your way down. Look, it's probably not going to be possible to sort of pay off a mortgage in any, quickly, but other sort of bits of debt that you might have lying around, especially things like credit card debt, I found that to be incredibly useful. And I've used it a lot in the advice that I give to my clients. And they've also found that to be a very good way of getting rid of the debt, which just frees up more money that you can invest.
I think that's very important information that you just shared there, because we are a country that suffers with debt, and an emergency fund can go a long way to helping people avoid that. So thank you very much for sharing that with us.
It's a pleasure to me.
Finally, we have Keegan Marsha, a director at Parity Investment Partners. Keegan, can you tell us about what's the biggest financial mistake you've made? And once you've taken us through that, I'd love to hear the best piece of financial advice you've ever received.
Good morning, Tumi, and thanks for having me. Great question. One of the biggest financial mistakes I've made, and I think many investors fall into, is trying to time the market, which I unfortunately did in 2022. Trying to exit the market before a drawdown and re-enter when it's perceived to bottom out. The reality is no one knows, and no one can consistently and accurately predict the exact or even approximate tops and bottoms of the market. Market timing is incredibly tempting. We all want to avoid losses and jump in just before the next rally. But here's the problem. To successfully time the market, you need to get two decisions right. You need to know exactly when to get out, and then you need to know precisely when to get back in, which, again, no one knows. And the truth is the market doesn't wave a green flag when it's about to surge or a red one when it's about to crash. More often than not, the biggest gains come right after losses. And if you're sitting on the sidelines, you miss out. An easy example of this was April this year. On April the 3rd, the US stock market increased significant single-day decline since the biggest decline since the COVID pandemic. The S&P 500 dropped by 5% and the Nasdaq dropped by 6%. However, the very next day, the markets rebounded significantly. The Nasdaq surged by 12.5%, making its largest single-day percentage gain since 2001 and the second largest on record. While there may occasionally be signs or indicators, the truth is that no one can reliably predict the market's short-term movements. A simple way that I've recovered from it is, like I said, it's simple but not always easy. The answer is I've stayed invested. The biggest way I've recovered from the mistake of trying to time the market is by shifting my focus to consistency and discipline. Instead of attempting to predict short-term movements, I've committed to staying invested and adding capital regularly, regardless of market conditions. This strategy, known as Rand cost averaging or dollar cost averaging globally, allows me to effectively smooth out my entry points over time. By staying invested and sticking to a regular contribution plan, I've not only recovered from past mistakes, but I've also positioned my portfolio to benefit from long-term growth and compounding. The key lesson: trying to guess market tops and bottoms is a gamble, but long-term disciplined investing is a proven strategy. And I think, just to finish off your question, the best advice I've received is timing the market beats timing the market. It sounds simple, but it's profoundly true. Trying to outsmart the market usually ends up hurting your long-term returns. Staying the course, even during volatility, has proven to be a far more effective strategy. And to give you some context, over the past 94 years, the S&P 500 has returned an average of 10% annually, even after factoring in recessions, wars, inflation, and market crashes. But missing the 10 best trading days over the past 20 years would have dropped your return from 10 to 5%. And 7 of the 10 best days in the market occurred within 2 weeks of the 10 worst days. That's why trying to time the market is almost impossible. In the end, the best advice I received is simple but powerful. Timing the market beats timing the market. It's a reminder that long-term success in investing doesn't come from predicting the next move. It comes from staying patient, staying consistent, and trusting the process. Markets will rise and fall. Sentiment will shift. Headlines will always create noise. But staying focused on your goals, managing risk, and giving your investment time to grow is ultimately what builds real wealth.
Thanks for that, Keegan. A key lesson there that you can't go wrong with staying invested and making regular contributions.
Thanks, Tumi, and thanks for having me.
And there you have it, 5 deeply personal, powerful stories from professionals who've built careers helping others avoid those very same pitfalls. If there's one big takeaway from today, it's this. A financial mistake isn't the end of the road. It's often the start of real growth. We all make money mistakes. The key is not to avoid them entirely, but to learn from them and those willing to share theirs. Thank you once again for joining us on this 100th episode of the Money Rules podcast.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Money Rules podcast. To listen to more, go to moneyweb.co.za or the Moneyweb app and follow Moneyweb News for daily updates. Moneyweb, your trusted source for business and investment insights.